Now, for our next speaker, I'm very pleased to introduce Winston Chang, a software engineer over at our studio and the author of the R Graphics Cookbook. For this talk, Winston will be talking about a quicker and simpler way of writing Shiny applications called ShinyExpress. So without further ado, I will hand the floor over to Winston. Take it away.
All right, thanks, David. My screen is being shared right now. Let me bring up this title slide. Okay, so yeah, thanks for having me. I'm going to be talking about ShinyExpress, and this is for Python. And I want to just kick off this talk with this application that I've been experimenting with, sort of for my own edification. This is an app that is for machine learning, and it's for doing image classification. So the idea is to train a model to classify images, classify the content of images. So I'll just start this little video here of what we're doing. First, we have to label these images. All right, so this is a bird. We don't have any labels yet, so we'll just type in bird there. This is a human. We don't have the human label yet, but once we'll type it in there, and you'll see like the data gets updated in that table over there as we go about this. This is a bird, another human. This is a human wearing a sleep mask, so our model is going to be really good at recognizing humans doing all sorts of weird things. Another human getting hit in the face with something. That's me. Keep going. Birds, human with a funny mustache, and a human who applied makeup by herself. So our model is going to get really, really wide-ranging training here, and then this is another bird. Right. So this is obviously a Shiny app, and I built this using ShinyExpress, and I just want to show you what this code looks like before I say more about what ShinyExpress is. So this code should look, if you've done Shiny for Python before, or even Shiny for R, it should look familiar, but also a little bit strange. So we have here, these familiar things like layout columns, UI.card, render image here, render UI, and then we have these inputs, input action button, another UI card, and render data frame. And we also have this weird thing like using with here in indented blocks. So a lot of these functions should look familiar, but the way that they're sort of organized is probably a little bit strange. So with that background there, what is ShinyExpress? Well, it's a new syntax for writing Shiny applications for Python. And the idea is that you can write the same app with less code. The UI and the server code is sort of mixed together. It's not kept separate, as you saw in the previous code example. And it retains all the power of Shiny and Shiny's reactive programming model and all that flexibility. And then also the existing syntax, Shiny, we had to give it a new name so that we could distinguish between these two things. So the existing syntax, we call it Shiny Core, if you see that in the documentation. All right, now here's the really sort of most basic, Shiny app that does anything that really does anything at all. So I'm going to show this app in the Shiny Core syntax and show it how it's different for ShinyExpress. So we start off with some imports here. We say from Shiny import some stuff. We create this app UI, and inside of there we have this a page fluid, and inside of the page fluid we have an input slider and an output text. All right, so there's the input slider here, and then output text is over here. Okay, so that's the UI part of the application. And then we have the server code. So this is a server function. And inside of there, we have a render text. And then this function that takes input.n, that's the slider value. And then it puts that in a string and returns that string. All right, and that string gets put into the web page there. That's the dynamic part of the application. So then finally we have the app part, which is we put the UI and the server together and create an app object. Okay, so that's a basic Shiny Core application. For Shiny Express, there's some changes. So first thing is that you don't need to define this app UI variable, and you don't need to use a page fluid. You don't need to have an output text. That will get inferred automatically, and I'll explain how that works later. You don't need to create a server function, and you also don't need to create this app object. All right. So this is the corresponding Shiny Express app. So the changes are, we say from shiny.express, import some stuff. And then we say, we just say UI input slider. We just sort of put that at the top level of the code in the in our app.py file. And then we can also just call render text right here. And we don't need to have the output text. The output just sort of magically appears on the web page. Yeah, so Shiny Express, it does all the stuff that Shiny Core does, but you don't have to write these bits of the code, the ones that are crossed off here. But it's still all happening under the hood. Now, why did we create Shiny Express? Well, obviously, it lowers the bar for users to get started quickly. You can imagine that just writing those few lines of code you needed for that Shiny Express app is easier for people and quicker than having to create the app, the UI and the server function, and then combine those things together into the app object. So that's really helpful for for new and existing users. Like I like using it. I mean, obviously I have a lot of experience with Shiny, but I like using Shiny Express to be able to quickly just build stuff and try things out. And also in the Python world, there are other web frameworks that make it very quick and easy to get started building web applications. So Streamlit is the most prominent one of these, and it's that Streamlit makes it very easy and very quick to build something something functional. And so so in the Python world, there is sort of people are used to being able to do this, and there's there's sort of an expectation that, well, it should be easy to get really easy and small amount of code to make something that make a usable web application. So we sort of wanted to meet users where they are in that respect. But the other important thing is that there's no ceiling to Shiny Express. It's not Shiny Light. It's not like some stripped down version of Shiny. You can do the same things with Shiny Express as you could with Shiny Core. You just express it in a different way. But I did put an asterisk there because there's a feature regarding modules that we are still that we are planning on implementing that is not implemented yet. All right. Now, some things to know about Shiny Express. So I'm going to talk in a little bit more detail about the Shiny Express syntax here and how it works. So first is that the UI elements automatically render. So if you put input slider here at the top level, it just shows up on the page. Input text here, it just shows up on the page here. You can put strings like hello, and that just appears there. And you can also add like HTML elements, like this is a div with bold, like a font weight bold. So, and that just appears down there. So that's really straightforward. You just put that at the top level of your app.py file. The next is that these render functions, these are the functions that Shiny uses to, they take inputs and then they do something, and then that gives them output that gets shown dynamically in your application. These render functions automatically create their output elements. So in a Shiny Core application, you would see stuff like you'd have a render plot in your server function, and then in the UI, you'd have a corresponding output plot. You have a render code, or similarly render text in the server function, and then you'd have an output code or output text in the UI. For Shiny Express, you don't need to do that. when Shiny Express is evaluating this code, it knows that this is this render plot decorator actually returns a renderer object, and that object there's a method on it that Shiny calls, and it's like, hey, what output UI should I put here when I encounter you in this app.py file, and it will give this output plot, and that will get stuck into the UI. All right, so all you need to do is put the render plot here and render code, and then your app will work like this. Okay, and I mentioned this previously, but I'll say it again. The UI and the server code are intermingled. You can mix them together. This is server code. This is code that does something on the server in response to reactive inputs. So you say render code, and you give it a function, and then right next to that, or below that, you can say input slider, and it'll put the correct UI elements on the page. And I also wanted to give an example here of stuff that isn't displayed in the UI. So this is a reactive calculation, or similarly a reactive effect. You can put those in your app at the top level. Reactive calc, reactive effect, just in regular functions. And those things don't have a UI to display. So those will not be displayed at all, but they will work, but they won't. Nothing will show up in the user interface, which is what you want. Okay, next for layouts, there's some of these elements are container elements. All right, so this is a Shiny Core app. So I'm calling this is the first URI or container element that I want to point to. This is page sidebar. Inside of that, there's a sidebar. Inside of the sidebar, there's there's a slider and some text here. And then we have another container element, a card. That's this thing here. And inside of that, there's the plot. All right, so that's Shiny Core. The corresponding Shiny Express code looks like this. So for number 2 here, the sidebar, we would say instead of just calling UI sidebar, we use the with keyword here. We say with UI sidebar : and then everything inside of this indented block will be put inside of the sidebar. And similarly for UI card, we say with UI card, and then in this case we can put just the render plot here. We don't use output plot. And you might be wondering where number 1 went. Well, you can see it went away. I love the animation. The page sidebar is not necessary. So with Shiny Express, as it runs the code on the page, it sees, hey, there's a sidebar here. So then it knows, okay, well, I have to put this has to be a page sidebar. If this with UI sidebar wasn't here, then it would use like a page fluid or page fix. I can't remember which one offhand. And if there was other things, like if there was a nav panel, then it would use page navbar. So that's like the tabbed UI. So it will just sort of figure that out. So you don't have to put in this page sidebar there. Okay. All right. So I'll give you a little bit of some information about how Shiny Express works. So building the UI happens once. When you run your app with Shiny Run, it evaluates the app.py in a special way, which is actually similar to how Jupyter notebooks work. So each statement in that file is evaluated. And if the returned value can be put in the UI, it will be put in the UI. It'll be stored. So that includes like Shiny UI objects like inputs, tag objects, things like cards, stuff like that, in strings as well. And if it encounters these render objects, these render functions, those objects, Shiny will ask them like, hey, what is that? What is the UI I should put in this location for you? And it will return, the corresponding output. So the first time when you do Shiny run, it runs all that code and it saves that UI it saves it as, you can think of it as HTML. There's actually like a step before HTML, but you can think of it as like there's HTML web page that will get sent to the web browser when somebody connects. Now, when somebody does connect, for each user session, it will run all that code again. Most of the UI stuff will just sort of be ignored. That is also very fast though. So like if you create, like a slider, that takes almost no time at all. But it'll run all that code, and each user session will get its own scope for if you've got variables and reactive stuff in there. So like render functions or reactive calc or reactive effect. Each user will get their own set of those, and they won't interfere with each other. Now, when would you want to use Express versus core syntax? So Express is better for getting things done quickly because there's just less code you have to write. Core syntax is better for larger, more complex apps because keeping the UI and the server logic separate. That adds more structure. And as if you've worked on software, like larger scale software, you know that like as stuff gets bigger and more complex, you need to sort of impose more structure in order for you to be able to wrap your brain around it. So Shiny core syntax does that, and so it is better for creating larger, more complicated apps and keeping them maintainable. So, but if you're just getting started, use Shiny Express, and that's our introductory documentation now uses the Shiny Express syntax. And again, I mentioned this earlier, Shiny modules don't yet work in Shiny Express, but this work is planned. So if you want to use Shiny modules, right now you have to use Shiny core syntax. Okay, now another place that this comes up is in Cordo dashboards. So this is an example of a Cordo dashboard. So it's using Cordo to generate the UI, the front end, and then on the back end, it's running Shiny. So in order to do this with Cordo, you say format is dashboard, and importantly, you have to say server Shiny here. And then we've got these Python code chunks, and we say from Shiny Express import some things. And then in Cordo, we do the layouts with this markdown syntax. So this is how you create a sidebar in Cordo. And then in the Python code block, you can say input checkbox group, and those things show up here. And in this dashboard format, we created a tab, this plots tab, by putting a top level header here. And then we have a Python code block here where we just say render plot. And again, the output here just shows up like it does in Shiny Express. So some little background insider knowledge here. This Cordo dashboards with Shiny, this was actually implemented before Shiny Express. So we wanted to make it really easy to use Shiny in Cordo. And we've done similar things with Shiny and R Markdown in the past on the R side. But so we implemented this for Cordo, and as people were playing around with it, we thought, man, this would be really great if we could just write Shiny apps, regular Shiny apps this way without, even without Cordo. And so this is actually where it comes from. Where Shiny Express comes from it comes from this work with Cordo. All right, and that is Shiny Express in a nutshell. If you want to learn more about it, you can just go to the Shiny for Python website right there, and our documentation covers Shiny Express. There's one other thing I wanted to mention. Probably people are wondering this already, which is what about R? So we have made like a sort of a really quick prototype of being able to run our Shiny code in a Shiny Express-like syntax. And it works. There's a lot more that would need to be done. There's a lot of details that need to be filled in and documentation that would need to be written. Right now, we haven't planned out that work to do Shiny Express for R because people seem there's already a lot of Shiny for R users who seem like they're quite knowledgeable and satisfied with being able to use it that way. But if that sounds appealing to you, we'd like to hear from you. That would be a useful piece of information for us as we plan our work. All right, so that's it. Thank you. It's over here.
Great, thank you, Winston. There was a lot of questions on this one. One of them, your suspicions were correct. People were curious about the possibility of an express version of R Shiny. And yeah, so it seems like there might be some demand for that. One question we had from Albert Rapp, the previous speaker, he asked if there is an advantage of using with UI.sidebar compared to using UI.sidebar.
So I'm trying to, okay, so if you're using Shiny Express, you say from shiny.express import UI, that UI.sidebar will only work with. That's different from, so that's Shiny Express, from Shiny Express import UI. That's different from Shiny import UI. So if you say from Shiny import UI, that sidebar has to be used with nested function calls. So those two things are, they just have to be used differently. Is there any advantage to use? I mean, the advantage is that you get to use the Shiny Express syntax for it. There's not going to be like any real performance differences. Oh, actually, I'm sorry. Well, there is one advantage to it that is important, which is, I mean, in theory, you could use the the regular Shiny UI.sidebar in a Shiny Express app, but you wouldn't be able to put in things like a render text right in there. It's not smart enough to handle that. In order for putting a render text inside of one of those components, you need to it needs to be done using with.
Okay. Someone was curious about the because I believe you don't have to directly assign an output ID, right, when you're rendering in Shiny Express.
Right.
So is there any chance of conflicts in that? How is it assigning that ID? Because I presume it is assigning ID. And is that something that developers need to keep in mind when they're using Shiny Express?
Yeah, so for Shiny Express, if you say render plot, and then the next line you say def like plot1. So the name of that function is what will be used as the ID, the output ID. So you have to make sure your functions have different names. Although typically, it's typically if you're using if you're using VS Code to edit it, it'll tell you if you have two functions with the same name. So that can be helpful. Any sort of IDE will, well, not any, but many IDEs will pick up that information and let you know about it.
Yeah. Can you just explain a little bit more about how it decides to place the outputs, because it sort of does that dynamically, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Or what's the logic behind that?
Yeah, it's actually really simple. If you have like let's say you have input text here, and then input slider, and then in the next right below that you have render code or render text. It's wherever that appears in the code, you can think of it like as, it'll just stick in the output code right there, wherever the render code appears.
So it's literally so you could have more UI code below the server code that you've now written.
Right. Yeah. You can mix it however you want.
Okay, that's something that I think that was a misunderstanding that I had about that.
Yeah, and actually, I was going to say if that's something that's different from like how Streamlit works. That's one thing that I think a lot of Streamlit users run into, where the things have to appear in a certain order. And if you want to access a variable that was from an input, that input has to be above the place that you're accessing it, unless you do there's some things you can do to work around that, but it's a little bit more work.
Is there any sort of performance differences of using Shiny Express generally compared to just base Shiny, normal Shiny?
Yeah, I mean, there's in some ways, like, there's the cost of evaluating all that code. Um, like running the UI code, it does that each time somebody connects. It is usually like really trivial. Like if I call, you know, input text, right? That's some very, very, very fast Python code. There can be things that are a little bit more expensive. You have to be um, more careful about it. Like if you have, let's say you're loading a data set, you know, you could be loading a CSV, or like say you're loading a data set from a database. Um, the By default, the way you write it in Shiny Express, each user will get their own. That will happen once for each user. Um, I didn't touch on it here, but um, you can create another file called globals.py, and if there's anything that happens in there, that only happens once, and the results are shared for all users. So in a Shiny Core app, you'd achieve the same thing just by putting all of that code for those shared objects just outside of the server function. So it's a little bit, you know, it's a little bit more straightforward for Shiny Core to be able to do um, to share those objects. And so that's a place where, you know, there could be some performance, you know, slight performance penalty. Well, or it could be large for Shiny Express. I mean, just depending on what you're doing with your code.
Yeah, yeah, that makes sense. Yeah, I'm curious. We've heard a lot about some new additions over the conference, particularly today, like the extended task feature that's being rolled out, and now we're seeing Shiny Express. And I'm curious, is there any other sort of features that are coming in the pipeline for Shiny? You know, sort of things that you wouldn't even imagine would be solutions that are coming soon, but then when they come, you're thinking, God, how could I ever live without this? Is there anything like that coming down the pipeline?
Well, so we had a Shiny for Python release earlier this week, and there was some really great work on data tables that the user can edit. That was done by Barrett Schlurke. So that actually you saw, I didn't, I wasn't, they weren't editable in that first example app that I had, but you know, it was the selected rows were updated dynamically, and I didn't show it in that example, but you can also click on a row in that table, and it would display the image for that row. So having those tables with sort of the interactivity and editability, that's something that we just came out with, and there's a fair bit of work remaining for the editable data tables. So we're just sort of getting started on that. Any big features? You know what? I'm sorry, I'm like blanking right now at the moment.
Yeah, that's okay. I mean, tables alone. I mean, I feel like we're always having to use third-party packages, you know, DT particularly, or our Hanson table. But yeah, it'd be great to get some native, you know, proper table functionality in Shiny. I mean, that's my opinion personally, but you know.
Yeah, I mean, it's great. Yeah, you know, just having it there and being able to use it for that toy app, that image classification thing, it was really great. You know, to now that ability exists, it's nice to I can just use it and not have to think hard about how I'm going to make that happen. So yeah.
Maybe just one last question. You spoke about how sort of one of the limitations of Express is that you have to, or your server and your UI are sort of indistinguishable within the script. You haven't separated the server and the UI. Is there a way to actually separate them, like in different files, for example?
It would be really, really awkward. I think you'd have. I'm trying to think of even to expose some of these functions. You'd have to like run some of these other files. You have to evaluate them in the special way that we do for Shiny Express apps, where you know it saves, you know, the result of each statement. I don't know if that function is exported or not, but I mean, I think in theory you could, but it would be really awkward. That I don't know why you would want to, but you know, if there's something that I'm not seeing with that, then I'd be interested to hear about it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Right. Well, I really appreciate your time today. It was really good to hear from you. So yeah, thank you for coming to speak.
Oh yeah,
Speak to us.
Thanks for having me. This is a lot of fun.